The assignment no one wanted. In the heart of southeastern Nigeria lies the Udi Forest, a place whispered about more than it is spoken of. Its edges are thick with vines, its interior cloaked in a green so dense that the sun itself must fight to break through. But it is not the darkness that keeps people away. It is the stories. The warnings. Villagers say the forest is cursed. They speak of the Jini Nagba Azu, a serpent the size of a tree trunk, with scales that shimmer like oil and eyes like burning coal. According to legend, it is no ordinary beast, but a guardian or a punishment. Some claim it speaks. Others say it eats memories before it eats flesh. But what they all agree on is this: people who enter Udi often do not come out. For decades, hunters, herbalists, and the curious had gone missing. And yet, still, every few years, someone tries. Now, it was the students' turn. At University of Enugu, final year biology students were abuzz with graduation around the corner. That was, until Professor Nwok, a man respected in academic circles for his sharp mind and traditional knowledge, announced a final assignment. "You are the best among your peers," he had said to 4 stunned students. "You will go where few have gone. You will retrieve something that could change medicine forever." Adanna, the top of her class, was chosen first. Brilliant, bold, and principled, she had a reputation for standing up even to professors when truth was at stake. Her calm intelligence made her a natural leader. Then came Obinna, the charming and skeptical one, whose wit often hid a deeper fear of failure. Molo, the soft-spoken genius from the north who believed in logic over myth. And finally Hawa, headstrong and curious, with a rebel's heart and a healer's instinct. Their task: to find and document the rare medicinal plant Okodundu, believed to grow only in the deepest parts of Udi Forest. A plant wrapped in legend, said to cure all diseases, even hot aging. But this was no ordinary school project. Unknown to the students, Professor Nwok had his own reasons. Not academic glory. Not medical advancement. He believed the rumors that Okodundu granted immortality. He had searched for it in books, scrolls, oral tales from ancient custodians of forgotten traditions. Now, with funding from a secret donor and time running out on his own health, he planned to use the students to get what he could not. He didn't tell them about the others who had tried. He didn't mention the hunters who never returned. And he certainly didn't mention the serpent. When the group arrived at Udi village, they were met with silence and stares. Old women turned their faces away. Children pointed, then disappeared behind walls. One man spit into the dirt and whispered a prayer. "I'm not going," said the first local guide they approached. "God forbid," said the second. Finally, someone pointed them to Kochi. A young man with strong arms, restless eyes, and a haunted face. "I know the forest," he told them, voice low. "I can take you, but I will not go far." He said his brother had entered the forest 3 years ago. He never came out. "Don't go," Kochi told Adanna privately that night. "Tell your people this is not science. It is sacrifice." But the students had no choice. The assignment was tied to their final grade. And Professor Nwok had a way of pressuring with a smile. At dawn, with supplies packed and reluctant villagers watching from behind half-closed doors, the 5 set off. Kochi led them toward the edge of the jungle, machete in hand. The air grew heavier. The buzzing of insects gave way to a strange, unnatural stillness. A few hours in, Kochi paused. "This is where I stop," he said. "The forest changes beyond here. Even the birds know not to sing." Obinna laughed nervously. Molo adjusted his glasses. Howard took out her notebook. And Adanna just looked ahead, into the green wall of shadow. "We'll be okay," she said. "We have each other." But Kochi didn't smile. He stepped back. And the forest swallowed them whole. Behind them, something moved. A branch, or a tail. From high in the canopy, something with ancient eyes watched them. It had seen the hunters. The priest. The strangers with cameras and tools. Now it saw students. And it waited. The jungle begins to hunt. The deeper they moved into Udi Forest, the more it felt wrong. There was no wind. No birdsong. No rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just a suffocating silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on damp earth and the distant groan of ancient trees. Even the insects seemed to avoid this part of the forest, as if the air itself had grown heavy with dread. Kochi's eyes darted back and forth, machete trembling slightly in his grip. He muttered prayers in Igbo under his breath. "This is not the same forest I used to hunt in," he whispered to Adanna. "Something is awake." She didn't reply. No one did. Then the sound came, soft, dragging, and slow. A scraping noise, like something large moving across the ground. They turned a corner and froze. There, in the middle of the narrow path, was a shade snakeskin, longer than a bus, thick as a man's torso. Pale, translucent, and fresh. Obinna stepped back instinctively. "That's not a snake," he muttered. "That's a monster." Molo crouched to touch the edges, curiosity briefly overtaking fear. "The skin is still warm," he said. "Whatever it was, it's nearby." It found them before they could even plan. The trees exploded with movement. A monstrous anaconda, larger than anything they'd imagined, crashed down like a falling tree. Its scales shimmered with wet darkness, and its eyes glowed like molten gold. There was no time to scream. Molo tried to run, but the serpent's body wrapped around him like a whip. One moment, he was there. The next, only his shoe remained. Swallowed whole. Panic tore through the group. Owa screamed. Obinna fired his flare gun in panic, the light bouncing uselessly off the creature's hide. "Run!" Adanna yelled. They didn't look back. They ran until the trees thinned into a steep embankment, and without hesitation, they jumped into a river below, crashing into cold, dark water. The current pulled them apart, then together, then finally spat them onto a muddy bank downstream. Soaked. Shivering. Shattered. Adanna coughed hard, her chest aching. Hawa lay curled beside her, sobbing. Kochi stared into the trees, eyes hollow. Obinna paced in silence, his face twisted with guilt and rage. Then the blame began. "You led us here." Kochi snapped. "We should turn back." Hawa cried. "We can't." Obinna barked. "You saw it, we're already dead if we go back." Adanna stood between them, hands raised. "Molo's gone," she said quietly. "But if we don't finish this, he died for nothing." They fell into silence again. By dusk, they stumbled upon a rickety wooden bridge covered in moss, suspended over a rocky chasm. On the other side, the air shimmered with faint green light. They crossed carefully, one by one, boards creaking underfoot. Then they saw it. A hidden grove, bathed in an eerie glow. Thick vines surrounded the clearing, and in the center grew Okodundu, its petals golden, its leaves pulsing faintly with life, its scent like warm honey and earth after rain. The legends were true. But below the bridge, coiled silently in the rocks, were baby anacondas. At least a dozen. Watching. Waiting. Obinna's greed came swiftly. He pulled a small pistol from his bag, eyes wide and manic. "You're the lightest," he said to Hawa, pointing the weapon at her. "Go. Get it. Bring the plant back." "You're insane," Adanna hissed. "We all want to survive," Obinna said coldly. "This is the price." Hawa's eyes burned with fury, but slowly, she climbed down. Every step was a gamble. The snakes hissed, but did not strike. The closer she got to the plant, the more their heads lifted. One hissed directly in her face, but then paused. The scent of Okodundu. It seemed to confuse them, disorient them. Hawa reached the plant, ripped it from the soil, and clutched it like a newborn child. She turned to climb back. Bang! A shot rang out. The bullet missed her head by inches. Obinna had fired. He didn't want to share the glory. Or the plant. Give it to me, he roared. Throw it. Now. Hawa didn't throw anything. Instead, she leapt, clutching the plant, rolling as she hit the ground near the others. The snake stirred but did not chase. The plant's scent seemed to protect her. Adanna helped her up, stunned. Obinna stood above them, gun still raised, but hand trembling. He hadn't expected her to survive. Something cracked in the jungle behind them. A tree fell, not with wind, but with purpose. The jungle was awake. And now, it was haunting them all, betrayal and the queen of the forest. Hawa stumbled through tangled roots and heavy fog, each breath burning in her chest. Her legs bled from the thorns, her arms shook from exhaustion, and her heart pounded, not from running, but from betrayal. Obinna had tried to kill her. He had pointed the gun, pulled the trigger, then fled. She clutched the Okodundu bloom tight in her fist, the plant's soft glow dimming in rhythm with her weakening strength. Somehow, she was still alive. Obinna, meanwhile, charged through the forest, heart racing. The stolen plant was secured in his backpack. His mind raced with visions of wealth, prestige, international acclaim. He didn't care who died. Not anymore. He burst into a small clearing and nearly ran straight into Kochi. The guide had doubled back after the river split them apart. His face was grim, shirt torn, eyes weary. He raised his machete. Where are the others? Obinna hesitated, but only for a second. Dead, he said. The snakes took them. I barely escaped. But Kochi saw it in his eyes. The lie. The way his hand gripped the bag. The blood not his own. The tremor in his voice. You left them, Kochi said coldly. You tried to kill her. Before Obinna could reply, the ground shook. The trees bent. A terrible hiss rose from the earth like steam from boiling water. And from the shadows slithered the queen of the forest. Her head alone was the size of a cow. Her body thick as a small car. Her scales glistened with ancient power, black and silver under the faint light of the Okodundu. Obinna screamed. Too late. With one crushing lurch, the queen Anaconda coiled around him. His bones cracked like dry sticks. His scream ended in a sickening snap. Kochi trembled. But he did not run. As the serpent fed, he crawled forward, heart pounding, and snatched the backpack from the blood-soaked grass. He whispered a prayer, not for Obinna, but for the girls. Let them live, he said. Let this cursed plant mean something. Then he ran. Deeper in the jungle, Adanna limped alone. Blood trickled from her temple. She had been separated after the river, trapped in a pit with sharpened stakes, left by hunters long gone. She'd climbed out with torn palms, every step since a test of pain and will. A whisper in the wind. A rustle. She turned, eyes wide. Hawa. They crashed into each other, arms locking, tears falling silently. They were too tired to speak. Too overwhelmed to explain. They were just alive. Together again. As they rested under a canopy of twisted trees, Adanna opened her satchel and gently pulled out the crumpled remains of Okodundu leaves she had collected earlier. Even now, the air around the plant shimmered. It confuses them, she whispered. The snakes. It scrambles their senses. Hawa nodded. That's why they didn't strike. Adanna looked at her, realization dawning. It doesn't just heal wounds. It's a defense. Maybe even a key. But they wouldn't have time to study it. Because the trees groaned again. And the queen had returned. Kochi emerged from the mist, panting, cut, and pale. He tossed the backpack to them. "Run," he said. "What about you?" Hawa asked. The serpent hissed behind him. "Closer now." "I know this forest," he said. "She won't chase if she's fed." And before they could stop him, before they could even scream, Kochi turned and charged the queen Anaconda, machete raised, voice echoing through the jungle. She met him with thunderous rage. The girls ran. They didn't look back. Tears blurred their eyes. Branches cut their arms and faces. But they ran until the trees parted and the cliff appeared once more, with the river raging far below. Behind them, the jungle screamed. There was no time to think. No time to mourn. They held hands. And jumped. Cold water slammed into their bodies. The current pulled them deep, then up again. Gasping. Kicking. Fighting. Until finally, battered and bruised, they washed ashore, this time, outside the forest. The jungle behind them fell silent once more. The air was clean. The sun shone. And in Adanna's fist, the Okodundu leaf still pulsed, the quiet, golden heart beating with power. They had survived. But the cost had been everything. Truth comes to light. The university campus, once filled with chatter and dreams of graduation, fell into a stunned silence when Adanna and Hawa returned. They arrived bruised, scarred, and thinner than when they left, but alive. The girls were immediately taken to the school clinic. As medics tended to their wounds, they spoke. Slowly. Painfully. And as they did, the truth unraveled. A special panel convened within hours. University officials gathered behind closed doors. Audio recordings were played. Journal entries retrieved from Hawa's bag. The Okodundu plant, wrapped in wet cloth and still pulsing with a faint glow, was brought in as evidence. Professor Nwok knew, Adanna said, voice robot firm. He sent us into a death trap. Not for science. For himself. He wanted immortality, Hawa added. He manipulated us. Lied to the school. Lied to everyone. The board listened. Some tried to deny. Others cried in shame. But the evidence was undeniable. That evening, in front of faculty, students, and cameras, Professor Nwok was arrested. His face remained cold as steel, lips tight, but he said nothing. Not when they listed the names of the dead. Not when students shouted insults at him. Not even when Adanna met his eyes and said, "You failed us all. But we will not fail each other." The next week, the verdict came down hard. Life in prison. On charges of reckless endangerment, academic fraud, and indirect responsibility for the deaths of Molo, Obinna, and Kochi. The university tried to contain the fallout, but it was too late. The media erupted. Headlines splashed across newspapers. Forest tragedy sparks outrage at university. Final year students sacrificed for professors' greed. Jungle plant might be cure of the century, but at what cost? Social media blew up with hashtags. Hashtag justice for Molo. Hashtag Kochi the Brave. Hashtag Okodundu truth. Adanna and Hawa were assigned a new research supervisor, a quiet and humble botanist named Dr. Mefa, who treated them with kindness and listened more than he spoke. With his help, they completed the research, not just on Okodundu's basic properties, but its neurological effects, pheromone release patterns, and its ability to confuse predators. The scent triggers a kind of sensory inversion, Adanna explained in a televised interview. It's both beautiful and terrifying. Nature's defense wrapped in healing. Soon, international pharmaceutical companies began to notice. Letters came from Switzerland, Japan, South Africa, the US. Grants. Funding. Requests to collaborate. Offers for labs. Adanna and Hawa could have left Nigeria. But they didn't. They stayed. Because this wasn't just about science. It was about honoring the fallen. In every slide they presented, Molo's name appeared in the data sheets he had once designed. In every research journal published, Obinna's name alongside a note about ethical failures and personal reckoning. And in the dedication pages of their thesis. A quiet line. For Kachi, who faced fear and chose love instead. They still had nightmares. There were still days when Hawa sat alone, crying beside her notebook, or Adanna stared into nothing during presentations. But they pressed on. And the world began to notice. 2 Nigerian girls who had survived what no others had. Who brought back a miracle from a forest of death. Who chose to heal instead of hide. The world saw survivors. But in their hearts, they knew. They were weaknesses. And they would never forget what the jungle took. Or what it gave. From forest to future. The plane soared above the clouds, its engines humming softly like a lullaby for the weary. Adanna stared out the window, watching the world stretch below her, oceans like spilled ink, cities like fireflies in the dusk. Across the aisle, Hawa clutched the lanyard around her neck, the words World Science and Healing Conference, San Francisco, gleaming in gold print. They were flying to the United States. To speak. To present. To be honored. 2 students, now scientists, whose names had once been lost in a forest no one dared to enter. Now, they were known around the world. But even in the press of business class seats, silk scarves, and smiling flight attendants, the past followed them. Flashbacks came in waves. Obinna's wild eyes as he pointed the gun. Molo's shoe lying on the bloody ground. Kochi's last breath as he charged the serpent. The hiss of scales. The scream of trees. The cold slap of the river as they jumped for their lives. Adanna turned to Hawa, her voice barely audible over the engine's whisper. We made it. Hawa didn't speak, but reached over and gripped her hand. Tight. When they stepped off the plane at San Francisco International Airport, journalists waited. Cameras flashed. People clapped. Nigeria's miracle girls, one banner read. Courage meets science, said another. But they didn't smile for the press. They smiled when a young black girl in a school uniform ran up with a notebook and said, I want to be like you. That's what mattered. The conference hall was packed. Nobel laureates. UN officials. Pharma CEOs. Students from around the world. When Adanna stepped on stage in her anchor-printed blazer, and Hawa in her flowing hijab, the room stood still. They spoke not just of Okodundu, its healing potential, its ecological implications, but of responsibility, of ethics, of the cost of discovery. They honored their fallen friends. They talked about listening to local wisdom, about respecting fear, and rebuilding trust between tradition and science. The hall rose to its feet in a standing ovation. But it was not applause that filled their hearts. It was peace. Back in Nigeria, months later, a quiet wind moved through the Udi Forest. It no longer belonged to fear. The government had protected it, declared it a national ecological zone, banning all unauthorized access. The villagers now served as keepers of the forest, not out of fear, but pride. A small carved wooden sign at the entrance read, Sacred Ground of Okodundu. Honoring the brave. And deep inside, where light broke through the leaves like golden threads, the jungle whispered stories. Stories of 2 girls who had entered the serpent's den, and emerged stronger. Stories that mothers told their daughters. That fathers recited by the fireside. That children whispered to one another with wide eyes and bated breath. Some say the queen Anaconda still watches from the shadows. But she does not strike. She remembers. And the forest remembers too. Not as a place of death. but as the birthplace of legend. The end.